Nvidia's focus on gamers has taken a clear step back. They used to set the standard for GPU innovation, from the original GeForce 256 right through to the RTX 3080. But starting with the 40 series, something changed. And now the 50 series feels overpriced, underwhelming, and riddled with issues. Nvidia's greed is the root cause, given they control 92% of the GPU market share, leaving AMD at 8% and Intel completely out of the equation. But Nvidia hasn't just gotten greedy. They've strategically shifted their entire priority away from gamers to serve a far more profitable customer, the AI industry. Just look at their latest financial report. In Q1 of fiscal year 2026, Nvidia's data center revenue soared up to $39.1 billion, making up 88% of their total revenue, more than 10 times greater than their gaming division, which earned only $3.8 billion. In this video, we'll unpack exactly how Nvidia's shift to AI directly explains every major issue gamers are experiencing with the 50 series, from how these GPUs are designed and priced, to how they're marketed and supported. Let's get into it. Before the launch of the RTX 5060, Nvidia deliberately withheld review drivers, cherry-picking reviewers that were willing to share what Nvidia calls previews. A notable outlet, GameStar, explained they only allowed the driver under certain conditions, weren't able to freely choose games, settings, or even GPUs to compare. These so-called previews tested 5 specific games at only 1080p resolution against cherry-picked comparisons, including the several generation-old RTX 2060 Super and 3060, guaranteeing the new 5060 would win. In addition, they tested using the new multi-frame generation, whilst the older generation cards didn't even support the standard frame generation, which is a whole other problem in itself. Other reviewers noted they got their hands on samples, but they weren't able to publish due to Nvidia withholding drivers till launch. By the time of its launch anyway, most reviewers were at Computex, so for Nvidia, it felt like the perfect opportunity, cut off regular in-depth reviews, and gatekeep only to those willing to bow to Nvidia's requests. But if Nvidia can control how we perceive the product before it even hits shelves, choosing who reviews it, how it's reviewed, and all while dictating what and when it's said, then Nvidia is optimizing perception over real-world performance. It goes beyond marketing, positioning consumers as the ones being misled through editorial control. They even resorted to threatening Gamers Nexus, a prominent figure in the computer hardware review space, stating that they would revoke access to not only the hardware samples, but also completely unrelated technical interviews with thermal and latency engineers. If multi-frame generation wasn't prominently featured in their review performance charts, on cards that didn't even support MFG, under the guise of securing budget, despite the fact that the only budget in this equation was GN's own internal editorial coverage for Nvidia's thermal engineers. It gives the impression that Nvidia sees editorial content as a reciprocal transaction, despite knowing that GN doesn't accept payments in return for coverage. But yet, Nvidia feels the need to act conditionally, remove access on samples, even on completely unrelated things like interviews, in order to push their new stipulations. And their blatant assumption of monetary gain through other ads that GN runs on their videos undermines the value of journalistic integrity, which is, put simply, plain dirty and manipulative. Even ignoring that, GN already had extensive coverage of DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation, though the ill-positive nature of the coverage probably prompted Nvidia's behavior. GN went on to further express even people at Computex felt threatened by Nvidia, extending to system integrators and other media, pushing GN to open a full investigation into Nvidia's shady business tactics. So what you're seeing is a complete erosion of editorial independence, one of the last lines of defense for consumers like you. Because if Nvidia can twist coverage through threats, withhold access if reviewers toe the line, and punish reviewers who don't play ball, then honest reviews become effectively impossible, compromising your ability to make informed purchasing decisions. And this is a symptom of Nvidia's shift in mindset. They no longer see reviews as necessary to inform the public, but as pawns to control perception. And if Nvidia is willing to go this far just to control how the media talks about performance, what they're doing with the actual performance itself is far more manipulative. It's baked right into the product, with DLSS 4 and MFG, and even performance charts on their own web pages. It's all a carefully crafted illusion. Centered around every marketing chart, you'll find DLSS 4 and MFG charts. DLSS, or Deep Learning Supersampling, upgrades from the CNN, Convolutional Neural Network, to a transformer-based model, improving upscaling, ray reconstruction, and DLLA, or deep learning anti-aliasing. But these weren't the real headline. Multi-frame generation, or MFG for short, is a jump from 1 extra frame to 3, on paper providing 4x the frames. But unlike DLSS 4, is locked to the 50 series, thanks to what Nvidia calls flip metering. And they took full advantage of the segmentation, comparing apples to oranges if you will, using traditional 2x frame generation on the 40 series, only to compare it to 4x multi-frame generation on the new 50 series cards. And this important distinction was denoted with only a fine print, almost in the same color as the background, leaving some people confusing this for real performance gains. And when Jensen Huang came on stage and claimed that the 5070 offered 5090 performance for 549, he was clearly exaggerating and knowingly misled. Thus, in real-world performance without MFG enabled, the 4090 is as much as 61% ahead, with the gap widening even more at 4K due to VRAM limitations. While at the same time, the 4090 has double the VRAM. MFG is the only context where the 5070 can even appear close to the 4090, yet only in ideal conditions. Turn off MFG or drop below the 70 to 80 FPS baseline and the illusion collapses, latency spikes, artifacting appears, and the experience worsens, and really feels like not just technically dishonest, but a clear and deliberate obfuscation of performance and reality. It's a consistent strategy as well. Nvidia's own slide decks for the 5060 Ti claimed 50x faster than the GTX 1060, a comparison clearly based on MFG and DLSS 4 versus raw performance. Not only that, but in the same example, it lacks distinction of the two variants of the 5060 Ti, the 8 and 16GB models. The 8GB variant would certainly be bottlenecked to 1440p max game settings, which Nvidia claimed to have tested here. The manipulation even extends to latency, claiming lower latency with DLSS 4 plus MFG, or showing latency equivalent to the 4060 Ti with standard 2x frame generation, despite a much higher frame rate on the new 5060 Ti. And the newly announced RTX 5050 also claimed a greater than 50x uplift over the GTX 1050, yet again through MFG and DLSS 4 and not native performance. But overall, it's a clear sign of desperation to hide the lackluster uplifts in the real world, because without these fake frames, the generation is embarrassingly flat, and if the numbers can be faked in software, specs can be starved in hardware. The RTX 5080 launched with just 16GB of VRAM, the same as the 4080 it supposedly replaced, and shockingly the same as both the 5070 Ti and even the mid-range 5060 Ti 16GB. For an $1,000 flagship tier GPU in 2025, 16GB is borderline inadequate, especially when AMD's RX 7900 XT and XTX have been offering 20 to 24GB since 2022 at similar or lower prices. Games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle have already begun pushing past the 16GB barrier 4K, even on medium settings with path tracing enabled. And that's not an isolated case. Modern engines like Unreal Engine 5 and Motor are increasingly demanding, with uncompressed textures, forced ray tracing, and inconsistent optimization, making larger VRAM buffers not just for future-proofing, but a baseline requirement. The fact that performance tanks and frame time spike once a frame buffer overflows shows how fragile the experience becomes, yet Nvidia continues to anchor their higher end cards at or below 16GB, not due to design limitations, but to upsell you into buying an RTX 5090, given it has double the VRAM, or worse, keep the doors open for super refreshes. The 5070 launched with just 12GB of VRAM, a glaring bottleneck identified by Hardware Unboxed and Gamers Nexus. Enabling ray tracing and MFG in Cyberpunk 2077 caused severe latency spikes and stuttering, which grow progressively worse as the frame buffer filled, and even at 1440p, the targeted resolution of the 5070, it buckled under the pressure in VRAM heavy titles. But it gets worse with the 5060 Ti. Nvidia clearly knew the 8GB variant was limited, given they essentially hid it from reviewers, only sampling the 16GB model. But regardless, the 8GB variant slipped onto shelves and was promptly exposed by Hardware Unboxed, finding it instantly obsolete in VRAM limited scenarios, with textures sometimes refusing to load or outright crashing, while the 16GB variant delivered up to 589% better performance and 1% lows. Given its memory size, it also suffered from PCIe interface limitations due to its use of only 8 PCIe lanes. On PCIe 4 or 3.0 platforms, which is still common amongst most budget setups, the 8GB variant suffers further performance degradation, showing a 70% drop in 1 1% lows, moving from PCIe 5 to 4.0. On the other hand, the 16GB variant mitigated this issue, relying less on the memory swapping, thus the PCIe bus, due to its higher memory buffer. And then there's the 5060 8GB, which I'm sure suffers from the exact same issues as the 8GB 5060 Ti, given it was also hidden from reviews. But here's the upsell. You pay $299 for a 5060, hit VRAM walls, and then you upgrade to a 5060 Ti 8GB, but that's still not enough. So you shell out yet another $50 for a 16GB model at $429. It's even more revealing when you realize an overclocked 5060 performs similarly to a 16GB 5060 Ti when you ignore those VRAM limitations. That's a $130 climb from where you started, just to get playable performance in most games these days, and that's by design. The tactic becomes even more cynical with the RTX 5050, where not only does it only come with 8 gigs, it's GDDR6, so it doesn't even share the same benefits of higher bandwidth like the rest of the series with GDDR7, while sharing only 12% of the CUDA cores of the flagship 5090, all for $249. That's $50 below the 5060, and given they both come with 8 gigs of VRAM, most will gravitate towards the 5060. And once they realize they're VRAM limited again, back in the funnel they go. It's a clear value loop, engineered not to help gamers, but to extract the maximum amount of money in each tier of product. To put it plainly, it isn't just segmentation, it's also planned obsolescence, done in real time under the guise of giving users choice. They're clearly setting traps. They nudge you towards a card that's designed to last, but don't give you any more value than just that. And just like with fake frames, if Nvidia can't give you more real performance, they'll make sure you pay more for less. When Nvidia announced the 50 series, they included MSRP listings that sounded, well, tolerable. The 5090 was said to be $2,000, the 5080 was $999, the 5070 Ti was $750, and the 5070 was $549. But those prices were basically fiction. Immediately upon launch, stock was scarce across nearly every major retailer. Micro Center, one of the largest PC hardware outlets in the US, has stores receiving as few as 4 cards each, with only 233 total RTX 5090s and 2,393 RTX 5080s across the entire country. By the time most scalpers got involved, some RTX 5090s were selling for $10,000 on eBay, with many sitting at the 6 to 7K range even before launch from pre-orders alone. And the pricing chaos wasn't just about demand, it was also about control. Nvidia warned of tight supply ahead of time, and they launched anyway, right as they ramped down the 40 series production, creating their own artificial demand while failing to fulfill it. Scalpers swooped in, retailers marked up prices citing tariffs, and even Nvidia's board partners raised prices days after launch. Zotac, for instance, spiked prices on the 5090 from $2,499 up to $3,000, and MSI and Asus followed suit, while even Newegg blamed tariff imports for sudden across-the-board increases. Cards were gone in seconds, average prices skyrocketed, and many models never even saw shelves at MSRP. And all this wasn't just the 5090 and 5080. The 5070 Ti was nearly impossible to find at its listed $750 price, with partner variants hitting over 1K, which is the MSRP of the 5080, but a lack of Founders Edition didn't help either. The 5070 did get a Founders Edition though, but not at launch. Users would have to choose from partner models with pricing spanning from MSRP up to $699. Those sold near MSRP, however, unsurprisingly were sold out, so effectively no one had a chance to get the 5070 at MSRP at launch. You would either wait or pay upcharged AIB models. Even the mid-range 5060 Ti had issues. The two variants that launched, the 8GB for $379 and the 16GB for $429, were indeed generational price cuts on paper, but as we know, the 8GB model was basically non-existent at launch and left off reviewers' hands entirely. And even when it did show up, it was often marked up by 10% over MSRP, so only the 16GB version was widely available, given its greater demand, until it eventually wasn't at all. The 5060 was the only one readily available at its MSRP of $299, some even in stock at less than MSRP, but Nvidia's decision to withhold review drivers likely had something to do with that, so they got what they deserved essentially. The limited coverage damned people's interest. Regardless, the overall pattern suggests orchestration of artificial scarcity, where MSRP becomes a marketing tool and not a promise. It allows them to claim affordability publicly, while allowing partners and markets to jack up prices behind the scenes. And when stock is this constrained, constrained, the MSR means nothing to you because you'll never get the product at that price anyway. It's psychological manipulation. Set a low anchor, let supply vanish, and let desperation drive spending. And all of it by design. Because this isn't just about pricing, it's part of the same systemic shift we've been tracking, where Nvidia no longer designs with gamers in mind. They design around maximizing profit, even if it means creating fake value, fake supply, and even fake accessibility. And if pricing is fake, performance is staged, and even segmentation is rigged, then what are we really paying for? Well, the RTX 50 series isn't the worst generational uplift we've seen, but it's easily one of the most disappointing. Despite keeping the same TSMC 4N node, Nvidia marginally bumped up the specs, yet expects consumers to pay significantly more for it. The 5090, for example, showed up with just a 27 to 35% uplift over the 4090 of 4K gaming. And even in ray tracing, where Nvidia normally excels, the gains maxed out at 44%, most hovered around 30%. Now that would be acceptable if it also didn't come with a 25% price increase. It's a similar story across the stack. The 5080 sometimes is 10 to 20% better than the 4080, and even frequently within 10% of AMD's 7900 XTX, which costs less and has 8GB more VRAM. The 5070 Ti usually lost to the 7900 XTX, and is only 2 to 20% ahead of the 4070 Ti Super it's supposed to replace. And the 5070, even at 1440p, the 5070 is just 1% ahead of the 4070 Super. And the 5060 Ti 16GB was about 15% faster than the 4060 Ti at 1440p. The 5060 did show a 22% uplift over the 4060 at 1080p, but it's bottlenecked at 1440p and only slightly edges out Intel's Arc B580, hitting the 8GB VRAM limit. And finally, with the 5050, even Nvidia's slides admit the 5050 is similar to a 4060 in raw performance without DLSS. And this all paints a clear picture. Nvidia isn't pushing performance, they're cutting corners. Performance uplifts are mostly due to marginal increases in CUDA cores by around 4 to 30%, and most of the time GDDR7 bandwidth, not architectural breakthroughs. And instead of improving with process nodes or architectural leaps, Nvidia leaned heavily on AI gimmicks like DLSS 4 and MFG to disguise the stagnation. Worse still, the CUDA core configurations has shrunk dramatically relative to the flagship. In the 700 series, the GTX 780 had 80% of the cores of the 7080 Ti. That's now dropped to 49% in the 5080 versus 5090. And the 5070 is down to just 28%, while the 5060 sits at a measly 18% of the 5090's core count, and as we know, the upcoming 5050 sits at 12%. This is more than just lackluster generational games. It's long-term decline in value, substance, and also intent. Nvidia is shrinking GPUs, not to save you money, but to squeeze more profit out of every price tier. They're offloading the responsibility of performance onto software tricks like frame generation, and using artificial scarcity and segmentation to justify those price hikes. It marks a fundamental shift in how GPUs are being built. There's less performance per dollar, less real architectural uplift, and more reliance on AI illusions and also VRAM upsells. When you look at the CUDA core data, pricing history, and performance benchmarks in aggregate, it becomes clear. The GPU market isn't evolving, it's regressing. So Nvidia isn't just giving you less, they're charging more for it and using technical gimmicks to make you think it's a step forward. But it's one thing to sell underpowered hardware at inflated prices. It's another thing entirely when that hardware is defective. Nvidia's quality assurance has seen a disturbing decline with the RTX 50 series, not just in user experience, but in actual functionality, leading to hardware failures, missing components, and months of broken drivers. It began with melting connectors, a haunting callback to the 4090 launch. Nvidia once blamed users for not plugging it in all the way, but even after PCI SIG updated the 12V high power connector to the so-called safer 12V 2x6 spec, the issue persisted into the 5090 and even the 5080, both using this new updated connector. Despite the redesign, users on Reddit reported melted cables and even melted PSU connectors, and DeBauer's testing showed dangerously high temperatures on individual cables under load, and in some cases, cards like Asus's RTX 5080 signaled pin issues despite being fully seated. In at least one case as well, the PSU itself melted. And what did Nvidia do? They dodged the issue yet again, letting AIBs, PSU vendors, and users bear the risk. But this wasn't the only hardware oversight. Users on Tech Power Up forums discovered something far worse. shipping GPUs with missing ROPs or render output units, a fundamental part of the GPU pipeline. A Zotac RTX 5090 had fewer ROPs than it should have, and after switching BIOS modes, reinstalling drivers, and even confirming hardware IDs, the issue remained. And at first, Nvidia only admitted to the problem affecting 5090, 5090D, and the 5070 Ti, but later added the 5080 to the list. And even notebook OEMs were reportedly asked by Nvidia to verify the 50 series laptops before launch, meaning Nvidia either knew the problem existed or suspected it early, despite later denying the claims that laptops were affected. GamersNexus tested the defective 5080 Founders Edition and found a performance hit of up to 11% at 4K compared to a fully functioning unit. And that's not a small defect, that's a silent downgrade. When your $1,000 GPU could be missing a crucial rendering component and running up to 11% slower, that's not bad luck, that's a breach of trust. And even if you avoided defective hardware, the software stack wasn't much better. From launch, users of the 5090 and 5080 reported black screens, random crashes, games not launching, cards disappearing from device manager, or even failing to post. Nvidia stayed silent at first, until public pressure forced them to acknowledge the issue, and they slowly released driver hotfixes. One driver claimed to fix black screens during boot, others claimed to fix the abundance of issues and crashes in a mountain of games, and another promised to fix HDR blackouts on DisplayPort, but users kept reporting the same problems. It took a full 16 driver releases, 10 full versions, and 6 hotfixes over more than 4 months, just to address what Nvidia calls edge cases. But these weren't edge cases. People across Reddit, YouTube, and even Nvidia's own forums logged issue after issue on 50 series, 40 series, and even 30 series cards. Nvidia's excuse? A GeForce driver is an incredibly complex piece of software. That's not good enough. When driver updates regularly break your hardware and it takes months to fix, that's not complexity, that's negligence. And it shows how Nvidia's shift away from gamers has real world consequences. Nvidia isn't just neglecting gamers here, they're actively cutting corners on the very fundamentals that used to define their brand. And worst of all, they're getting away with it. And what about older games? Well, they've become collateral damage too. While all the attention has been on DLSS 4, frame generation, and the melting connectors, Nvidia quietly pulled the plug on something far more fundamental, without so much as a warning. 32-bit CUDA support is gone, and with it, so is PhysX. It happened without a headline, buried in an obscure support article that barely made the rounds. So what does that mean? Well, GPU PhysX used to be one of Nvidia's flagship selling points. It let games like Mirror's Edge, Borderlands 2, and Batman Arkham City offload complex particle simulations, debris, smoke, and environmental effects onto the GPU, massively improving performance over the CPU-bound alternatives. But with the 50 series, PhysX is now disabled by default or forcibly runs on the CPU, bringing back the same performance bottlenecks we left behind a decade ago. A Reddit user flagged the issue after seeing massive slowdowns in PhysX-enabled games. Their RTX 5080 was defaulting to CPU-based PhysX, even when enabled manually, and Nvidia later claimed in their forums that 32-bit CUDA application support was officially discontinued. Older cards like the GTX 980, the 970, and even the 580 run these games better than the brand new RTX 5080. It's a literal downgrade generation over generation. But here's what that really tells us. If Nvidia can kill PhysX overnight with no transparency, what's stopping them from pulling the plug on DLSS, ray tracing, or even core rendering features in the future generations? It sets a dangerous precedent, one where your game library is only as good as Nvidia's latest driver support strategy. Legacy titles get left behind, not because they're obsolete, but because they're too inconvenient to support. And PhysX is just the first casualty. The real issue here is trust. Nvidia sold you proprietary features as value, performance, immersion, and longevity, but failed to maintain any guarantee that those features would last. And if features can vanish silently, it makes every future purchase that much more riskier. Just like with fake frames, artificial segmentation, and melting connectors, this is yet another example of how Nvidia is not building products for gamers anymore. They're building platforms to lock you in and leave you behind the moment you're no longer profitable. So where does that leave us? After everything we've gone through, from manipulated reviews to fake performance charts, inflated prices, melting connectors, and even silent feature removals, one thing's clear. This isn't the Nvidia gamers grew up with. The 50 series isn't just a stumble, it's a statement. A clear message that gamers are no longer Nvidia's priority. And when you zoom out, this becomes part of a much larger shift. Nvidia is no longer in the business of pushing gamers forward. They're in the business of AI, enterprise, and shareholder returns. Their gaming division is shrinking in priority, even if it's not in the numbers yet. But that doesn't mean you're out of options. options. Let's reframe this, because it's the first time in a long time that gamers actually have a chance to push back. You don't have to just buy AMD or wait for Intel to catch up. You can change the game simply by changing how you think about buying GPUs. Right now, cards like the RX 9070 and RX 9060 XT are shaping up to deliver 16GB of VRAM with solid raster performance and improvements to ray tracing and a renewed focus on value. Meanwhile, Intel's Arc Battle Mage, especially the B580, is bringing real competition back to the sub $300 space. And it's not about brand loyalty, it's about market correction. And if you're not switching brands today, understanding what matters now helps to shape what gets built next. Because your mindset matters more than your wallet. When consumers get smarter, companies cannot get lazy. And right now, Nvidia's counting on apathy, counting on momentum, counting on the fact that people will buy whatever has RTX slapped on the box. They're forgetting the one thing they used to understand: expectations shape reality. We expected performance, we got fake frames. We expected innovation, we got marketing spin, and we expected Nvidia to design for gamers. And that expectation is what they've stopped meeting. So maybe it's time to stop expecting Nvidia to act in good faith and start demanding better with your purchases. Because once expectations are raised, they can't go back. So let's make sure they don't. Anyways guys, that's all for today. Make sure to like this video, get subscribed, and watch this video on the screen right now. Peace.